People's number one phobia is the fear of speaking in public. In fact, it comes third on a stress list. First is the death of a spouse, second is divorce, and third is the fear of speaking to groups. These statements are the results of research into public speaking, and you can of course question them, but undoubtedly the great majority of the thousands of people I've worked with over the years are fearful and very stressed by the idea of having to speak to groups. So welcome to this audio briefing on presenting with power. My name is Judith Gilmore. I run a company called Effective Communications, and I want to talk you through the main areas I believe are essential to consider when making powerful and effective presentations. So first of all, why is it so important to acquire this skill? Well, it's obvious that you wouldn't be listening to this tape if you didn't realise that it's absolutely vital in today's competitive and aggressive world to become a more effective and powerful speaker. I think it's absolutely essential. I actually think it's one of the best ways of increasing your visibility within your company. And most of us, of course, try and avoid it at all costs. I would suggest that a lot of us try and hide behind the door when the presentations are handed out, with the fear of, I can't do that. Well, I believe that you can do that, and I think it's extremely important to believe in yourself that you can do it. And there are tips and there are skills and there are techniques that you can employ to become more effective. I also think it's part of the job selection process, because a lot of you listening to this tape will realise that you indeed had to do a presentation in order to get the job that you've actually got. And I believe companies nowadays are looking more and more for people to be effective speakers so they can stand up and sell and present the company. And whether we like it or not, I think a lot of us now are realising we have to be master of all trades, and one of them undoubtedly is making presentations. And I also seriously believe that it will enhance your prospects of promotion within your company if you learn and acquire these skills. Now, some of you listening to this tape will already be accomplished presenters. So you perhaps are using this tape to revisit and think through some of your own techniques, and I hope to question whether you are indeed using the right techniques. I believe this tape will act as a useful refresher to people out there like you, and also to introduce you to some new ideas and techniques. You might also want to use this tape to give to members of your team, people who need a lot of help in making presentations, people who are anxious and nervous, and this is something they can use to give them that quick bolster of confidence, to give them these techniques and ideas that they can then go out and use effectively. And also for some of you listening to this tape, you will undoubtedly be very fearful, very stressed, and very frightened about making presentations. And I think it's comforting for people like you to realise that you are not alone. In fact, very often on my courses, people will actually say to me, I haven't slept all night, worrying about this course. And some people will say, all night? I haven't slept all week. So it's a perfectly natural and reasonable response. And you mustn't feel worried about that, because it's okay to feel like that. The only problem with actually showing you're extremely nervous is that people in your audience don't want to know that you are in agony, because it makes them feel agonised as well. It makes them feel uncomfortable and stressed to know that presenter is having a hard time. I always draw the analogy of a swan. You know what a swan looks like when it's gliding along the water. It's calm, it's controlled, it's totally unruffled. But you know what the swan's doing underneath the water? Paddling like crazy. So that's fine. You can paddle like crazy. But my advice to you would be, don't let the audience know it. So for those of you who are nervous about making presentations, a lot of people will ask me why. Why do we become so nervous about doing it? And I don't have any easy answers for you, because it's a very subjective area, you see. There's nothing black or white about this area. In fact, it's very, very grey. Because what sends one person into fear about doing this, somebody else will not be fazed by a bit, and yet they're totally thrown by something else. And it's only when I realised that I could overcome those fears, and therefore I could help other people to overcome the fears, that I decided to set up my own business to help people become more effective in the way they were communicating and presenting themselves. People will also say to me, why is it that I'm all right in a meeting? Why is it that I can speak really effectively in a meeting, but when I'm asked to stand up there and make a presentation, I go to jelly? Well, again, I have no easy answers for you, but perhaps some of the ideas might be that you are then total centre stage. You are totally exposed to a group of people. Everybody's eyes are firmly fixed on you. There's also a lot of stake. There's a lot of fear of failure also when you stand up. There's a lot of status there. And it's also very much the fear of the unknown. A lot of us will realise once we get going, once we get into it, we feel so much better about making presentations. We get into the swing of it. So that's why I think some of us become fearful and afraid of making presentations. And there are now several areas that I would like to talk you through, which I believe are absolutely essential in order to make a powerful presentation. One of the perhaps most important areas is the idea of using the body as an instrument, because it is an instrument, and some people use their bodies incredibly effectively, and some people, I would also say, don't use their bodies very effectively at all. Some of you will have noticed when you watch people present that they tend to look like pencils. Everything gets incredibly rigid and incredibly controlled. And it's interesting when we look at people when they are relaxed and talking to friends that we are open, we gesticulate, we really throw ourselves into what we're talking about. And as soon as we take centre stage, all that naturalness goes out of us. Some of the postures that you have seen when you've been watching your people make presentations or just making general notes, some of them are effective and some of them are not so effective. Let's just think perhaps of some of the ones that aren't so effective. Be very careful about the macho posture, and by that I mean the hands behind the back with the chest pushed out, the shoulders back. This can look very, very defensive. It also, I would suggest, looks very unnatural and can look very aggressive. Now, I know people very often don't hold their hands behind their back to look macho. Very often the reason we put our hands behind our back is because we don't know what to do with these things at the end of our arms. And so a classic way of getting rid of them is to do exactly that, to put them behind the back. Very often I'll find the opposite. The hands are actually in a fig leaf at the front of the body, protecting our private parts. And again, what we're really doing, of course, here is holding hands with ourselves. And I would suggest this isn't natural either and doesn't look very effective. One of the big problems, as I say, is the hands. What do you do with them? Well, another thing that I often find people doing, and you'll see it undoubtedly a lot also, is that people put their hands in their pockets. So the hands go down in their pockets, and then it's a case of, oh, great, I haven't got to worry about that anymore. And then what do we get? Very often we hear money jingling, we hear hotel bedroom keys, we hear car keys. And again, by this stage, of course, a lot of the audience is saying to themselves, what on earth are they doing with themselves? Be aware of the folded arms syndrome as well. We're talking here, of course, about body language, and you'll want to take all of this with a pinch of salt, and quite rightly so, of course you must. But very often when I say to people when they folded their arms making presentations, when I've been watching them, were you nervous? Were you defensive? Did you not really want to be there? Very often they'll say, that's exactly how I felt. And it is a very defensive posture. I tell people, open up, be warm, be receptive, open up those arms, because it actually pulls the audience in to what you're talking about. Another problem, of course, as far as the body is concerned, is that we very often like to hide our bodies. We don't want them to be on show. And so a lot of us will stand behind desks when we're making presentations, and even preferably behind podiums, so that all the audience can see is just the top part of your shoulders and your head. I don't think it's effective. I say to the people I work with, have the strength and have the courage and have the guts to come out from behind the barricades, because you're so much more interesting when the audience can see all of your body rather than just the top part of it. And it doesn't matter, quite frankly, what size, what shape, what colour, what frame you are. Just use your own personal body to the very, very best of your ability, and use it as the instrument that it is to build rapport with the audience, to pull them in, to be interesting for the audience to look at. Another problem area that a lot of you have watched in people when they've been making their presentations, and it is a difficult area, and that's the area of the voice. And I would suggest to you, like the body, the voice is also a wonderful instrument, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't use it as effectively as they could. We've all sat through presentations where the presenter's voice has been a monotonous dirge, and it sent the audience to sleep. So do use your bodies. Make your voice go up and down, make it interesting, use it and vary it for the audience, because it is an invaluable tool to hold the audience's attention throughout the whole of your presentation. And in order to do that, you really have to work on it, you really have to use it. A lot of people, again, speak far too quickly, and it's so obvious, isn't it, when they do that they are nervous. It's a classic symptoms of nerves, and there's nothing worse than having somebody present to you at an incredibly fast rate, because when they finish speaking, we haven't been able to absorb the things that they've been saying, and we feel steamrollered by the rate of their speaking. So do remember and do pass on to the people that you work with the idea of pausing. Silence. Because silence and pausing is wonderful. It's wonderful for the audience, because the audience need time to take in what they're hearing. We need time, don't we, to assimilate what the presenter is saying. So give your audience time to take it in. I was working with a young fella not very long ago, and he spoke like a train throughout the whole of his presentations, and I said to him, "But you speak so quickly." He said, "Oh, I know I do, Judith, I always speak quickly." I said, "But why are you doing that?" He said, "Oh, I always speak quickly, deliberately, because I don't want to give my audience any time to think." I thought, what a bizarre piece of logic that is. Give your audience time to think. It's also wonderful pausing for you, because in those pauses you can think about what you want to say next. You can get yourself back on track. If you've started to speak too quickly, you can say to yourself, cool it. Everything's all right. Another thing I think we have to remind ourselves of is that we can stop talking, So we have to remember to give ourselves permission to stop talking. Somehow or other, when we stand up there, we feel this incredible urge to keep filling the silence, ers, ums, I means, repeating what we've just said, rather than having the sense to pause, say nothing, think, and get ourselves back on track. Some useful tips for some of you perhaps out there who are worried about your voices, and a lot of people are worried about their voices, and they say to me pleadingly, "Judith, I hate my voice. Is there anything I can do to improve it?" Well, actually, there is only you that can do something about it. Don't worry about your accents if you have accents. I think accents make us the people that we are. The only problem, of course, with that is if you have a very, very strong accent and your grammar isn't very good, then you're in real trouble. A couple of tips for you about improving your voice. Those of you that have children, why don't you close the door to your children's bedroom, get out their favourite bedtime story, and then really act out the characters for them? Your children will love you doing that for them, and you will also begin to understand and hear what your voice is actually capable of doing within that enclosed space. Something else I think we all have to remember as well is to lower our voices, men and women. When we are getting nervous and uptight and stressed, the voice, of course, gets higher and higher and higher very often. So I think it's very important to lower the voice, particularly when we're getting stressed, so that people don't realise it. Just remember to bring your voice down, make it low. We very often equate low voices, powerful voices, with competence and confidence. It's not always true, I know, but very often that is the perception. So do be aware what the audience is picking up by listening to the way that you use your voice. Another big problem area that, again, a lot of you will have seen is the problem of what on earth do you do with your eyes? Well, eyes in our society are vital. If you don't look people in the whites of their eyes in our society, people don't like it, do they? We have all kinds of adjectives we use for those kind of people. Shifty, nervous, timid, shy, insecure, low self-esteem, untrustworthy. We have others as well, sly, cold, calculating, arrogant, aloof, So in our society, eyes are absolutely essential. So we have to learn to use them to the best of our advantage to build warmth and rapport with an audience, because that's what they do. Your eyes build warmth and rapport with your audience. Now, a lot of people say to me, but I don't like looking my audience in the eye. I find them really, really distracting. Well, I have to agree with you. It is a distraction looking at your audience in the eye, because sometimes you see things there that you don't want to see. But if you're not looking at them in the eye, how can you possibly know who's on your side? How can you possibly understand what they're thinking about? How can you possibly know who's going to sign on the dotted line after the end of the presentation? So you have to make yourself look the audience in the whites of their eyes to actually build warmth and rapport and to understand who's on your side and who's with you. I also think that your eyes have to smile, you know. Your eyes have to sparkle with the message. I call it fire in the belly. You've got to have fire in the belly about what you're talking about, and then it will come out of you and it will light up everybody else that you're talking to. It's enthusiasm, isn't it? It's your enthusiasm, your fire, your commitment, your pizzazz at the end of the day, I believe, will actually sell your message, and the eyes are very important in helping to do that. I would also suggest something else that a lot of you are undoubtedly already using, but some of you may not be, and that is the use of cue cards instead of a script. I'm still surprised at the number of people who come to my courses clutching their script. Yes, it does have some advantages. It's like a child, isn't it, with a comfort blanket. You feel so much better when everything you want to say is written down on that piece of paper. But I would really advise you and all the people you work with to throw away the script, because I believe it is totally outweighed by the disadvantages. I encourage all the people I work with to use cue cards. Because if you are using a cue card, you see, and you have to use them correctly, of course, and I would suggest to you that you need to put down only key words on your cue cards. And that's hard sometimes because we tend to try and put too much on the cue cards, not having enough confidence in ourselves. But try and make yourself write down only the key word. And then if you have only the key word on your cue card, you see, you are forced to think. You'll notice what happens when you use a script. We have a tendency just to read from a script, don't we? And there's no thinking taking place at all. That's because the thinking was done when we wrote the script and then we just stand up and read it. That's why some of you will notice in presentations, as I often notice, that when somebody is interrupted by a question in the middle of their script, they don't really answer the question very effectively. And that is very often because they're not thinking. So key words on cue card will force you, you see, to think. And then if you're thinking, you also have to use natural, ordinary, everyday conversational language, because that's the only language that you have in your head, as opposed to if you write a script, then you sound terribly, terribly complex, terribly, terribly intellectual, and it doesn't sound a bit like you at all. You sound like a written script. You sound like a technical robot. You've probably all sat in conferences as well as I have, with the script of the talk on your chair. And in fact, the presenter hasn't even come into the conference room yet. The presenter eventually comes in. The whole of the conference room is awash with people turning over pieces of paper. The presenter's on page 2 and everybody else has finished. That's why I would also suggest those of you who are making presentations quite often to conferences really think seriously before you allow yourself to send off the text of the talk to the conference organisers so they can bind it in a book and give it to all the people sitting in those chairs before the conference even begins. I would suggest think very carefully about perhaps sending them just the outline of your presentation and then saying, after my presentation, there will be a full text of the script for you all to take away. So why is it then that cue cards are so much more effective? As I said, I think they enable you to sound like yourself. You are not script bound. You can be much more spontaneous. It means, of course, you can take out part of a presentation. You can add in parts of a presentation. You can change it around to suit the audience and to suit the subject that you actually have. The words then that come out of your mouth, you'll realise are much more the natural rhythms of speech. Do remember to put keywords on only. Do remember, by the way, to number your cue cards, and do remember to get them in the right order. And one other thing, try not to hold them rigid in front of you. Try not to grasp onto them with your hands. The whole point of cue cards is that you open your body up and use your body as an instrument with your cue cards in one hand or then the other. And you can even use cue cards as an extension of your arm. So you can actually use them as a wonderful tool, again, to build warmth and rapport with your audience. So we've discussed the idea of the body, the voice and the eyes as being instruments. We've discussed the advantages of cue cards over a script. I'd like now to discuss with you another vital area, and that is the content. What exactly are you going to say and how are you going to structure it? I think there's a tendency sometimes for presenters to think because they know their material so well that we work with it day in, day out, we assume everybody listening to us can also follow through the progression with us. And very often that's not the case. The audience need all the help that they can get. There's an adage that a lot of you will know, and it's this one, and I make sure that I follow it religiously. In the introduction, you tell the audience what you're going to tell them. In the development, you tell them. And in the conclusion, you tell them what you've told them. In other words, they're quite simple. They need all the help they can get. Don't forget they're listening to many presentations on many different subjects, so make it easy for them to digest the information that you're giving to them. And for me, I always follow a very, very simple structure. And this structure will lead me through any major formal presentation I ever have to give. Any impromptu speech, any vote of thanks, any difficult telephone call, any speaking up in a meeting. And we all know this structure. It's introduction, development, and conclusion. But sometimes in the real world, we forget how effective this structure actually is, and we forget to use it. I'd like to share with you some of the ingredients that I put into my introductions and some of the ingredients that I put into my conclusions for you to have a look at, to think about, to assess, to perhaps think through how you would normally structure your talk. When I begin my presentations, I always make sure that I have a very, very strong attention getter. When I'm starting my powerful presentation skills courses, the first words people will hear me say are these. Do you know one of people's greatest fears is doing exactly what I'm doing now? Standing up here to make a presentation to people out there like you. And by the time I've got halfway through that sentence, I see several heads in the group nodding. In other words, I have got their attention. They know exactly what I'm talking about. I call it really, it's like a bait. It's pulling the audience in. It's what is this woman talking about? Then I pull them into the topic of the presentation. We tend to hear a lot more of this kind of thing. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is so-and-so. I come from a company called such and such. I want to talk to you all about. Now that's fine. That's valid. And you will hear a lot of presentations begin in exactly the same way. For me personally, I never use that because everybody else uses it too. And therefore, for me, it doesn't have any impact because people are expecting that. I suggest to people, give your audience what they're not expecting to hear. And then you'll have more impact, you see. People very often ramble into a presentation. And very often people, of course, will apologise. And you've all heard apologies, haven't you? I was at a conference not very long ago when 5 out of the 6 speakers started with a classic apology. And the truth of the matter is nobody cares. Nobody cares. You've had the most horrendous journey trying to get here. What people want you to do is open up your mouth and get on with the job that you've obviously been paid to do. So I would say go for a really strong attention getter. Another thing I do in the introduction is I appeal to my audience's needs. Do make sure there is something in your presentation for the audience, because if there's nothing in it for them, it's for sure they're not going to listen. And then another thing I do is I make sure that I give the topic of the presentation. It's amazing the number of presentations we hear, isn't it? Where a presenter will stand up and they'll speak for an hour and a half, and by the time they finish the presentation, I'm still not sure, and probably you feel the same way very often, you're still not sure as to why we've all been gathered together in the first place. So do make sure you give the topic of the presentation, and then the audience will be so much happier listening to you, giving their time to listen to you. So moving then from the introduction into the development section. Most people make their talks, as I've said, far too complicated. They forget to hold the audience's hand. They forget to lead them through. It's like a menu. It's like setting out what the various courses are going to be. And once people know what the courses are going to be, they feel much happier and much more intelligent, being able to listen and follow you through. So, as an example for you, a very simple development might be, I want to talk to you first about what happened in the past within the organisation. Then I want to move you on to what's happening in the present. And finally, I want to talk through with you some of the ideas I think we should be putting into place for the future. I also believe you need to hold the audience's hand and connect each of those sections with connectors. So a very simple connector for me might be, so that's the first area I wanted to talk to you about. Now I want to move on to the second area, holding the audience's hand, pulling them through. The importance of making it easy for the audience to follow through is that according to some research, the audience will take on board 20% of what you tell them, and that's all. So make sure that you make it easy for them to understand. What about the conclusion? I think it's really important to let the audience know that you are concluding. So to use words like in conclusion, finally, to summarise, to bring it all together then is really effective, because we've all sat listening to presentations, and as soon as we've heard the words in conclusion, you know what happens. We perk ourselves up, we prick our ears up, we get ready for the end. Something else as well, please make sure when you finish, you do end on something really, really strong. Really work your presentation back up to a really strong climactic ending. I've heard, and so have you, far too many presentations close, and people really, really spoil the whole of the impact they've had by saying, well, that's about it then. Thank you all very much for listening to me. I would also strongly recommend what I call my 3-stage approach to making a presentation. It seems to me that a lot of us leave everything to the very last minute, which is fine for a lot of us because it makes the adrenaline flow. But then, of course, we panic totally at the 11th hour, grab our pens, grab our pieces of paper and frantically start to write. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I think a 3-stage approach makes so much more sense. My stage 1 for me is breaking the back of the talk with an outline. So I write down on a piece of paper all the areas I want to develop. I put my 3 ingredients in for my introduction. I link through very carefully my sections A, B, C, D as far as the development is concerned. I work through very carefully all the areas that I want to develop within that development section. I make sure that connectors are in place, and then I write down the 5 ingredients that I personally put into my conclusion, so that I have the whole thing written down as a structure. It's my basics, if you like. It's my skeleton. It's the bare bones. It's the essentials of what I need for the presentation. But then, of course, for most of us, that bare bones, the outline, is not enough. So then I'd recommend you to go on to stage 2. And stage 2 is when I write out the whole of my script. So I sit with my outline in front of me and I write out the whole script and I tick off each section as I go. And what it does is it makes me feel confident. There are going to be moments of panic, of course there are, but basically I know where I'm going at every stage in the presentation, and it makes me feel good, it makes me feel confident, it makes me feel that I'm accomplishing something. Now, some people hold their hands up in horror and say, Judith, I've got to write out the whole script. Well, I know, because so many of us are so incredibly busy, we don't always have time to do that. But I would advocate that to you if you have the time to do that, because we know what happens when we write things down. The words go into our heads. And once the words go in our heads, then we can find them so much easier when we stand up to speak to a group of people. So I write out the whole of the script. And there's another wonderful added bonus, you see, about writing out the whole of script. Because at the end of it, I have a wonderful written report. And then I can give that written report to my boss, you see. I can even give it to every delegate in the presentation room after I've finished my presentation, of course, and give it them to take away so they have a reference to what it is that I have been talking about. But now you see, if I stand up and read this written report to all of you, you're going to die of boredom anyhow. So now I go to stage 3. And in stage 3, I underline the keywords from my script and I put them onto cue cards. And you've got to find the right keywords, of course. A lot of people tend to put the wrong words on the cue cards. And a lot of you found that out, undoubtedly, in your past. You've got to get the right keyword and put your keywords onto the cue cards. And then I would suggest to you, stand up and practice. stand up in front of a colleague, stand up in front of a bedroom mirror, stand up in front of a supportive spouse, and actually practice your presentation. So you practice and practice and practice, rehearse and rehearse and rehearse until something amazing happens. You feel confident, you see. And you now feel confident because you know exactly what you're going to say and you know how you're going to say it. So we've looked then there at the structuring of a presentation. Now, a lot of you will be saying to yourselves, as people always do, but what about the visual aids? Well, I could talk to you a long time about the do's and don'ts of visual aids. And I tend to say things about visual aids that people don't actually want to hear, because in my opinion, people use visual aids extremely badly. And a lot of you out there know exactly what I mean by that, because we've all sat through presentations where the visual aids have very often ruined the presentation. The best piece of advice I can give to you here is do remember that you are the best visual aid that there is. There is no visual aid better than you are. And the problem, of course, is as soon as we turn on the visual aid, the overhead projector, the PowerPoint, then people don't know where to look. Do they look at the presenter? Do they look at you? Or do they look at the transparencies that you're showing? So you automatically dilute the audience's attention away from you. You've all seen presentations where the presenter is absolutely wrapped around the overhead projector. In fact, they have a love affair with the overhead projector, don't they, some people? I would say to you, your love affair should be with your audience, not with the overhead projector. We get this sort of umbilical cord on some people where they can't even drag themselves away from the overhead projector. They turn and talk to the screen, which is another big problem that we've all seen. They forget that there's an audience out there. They should be talking to them. They turn and talk lovingly to the overhead projector. Even when they turn the overhead projector off, they still turn and speak lovingly to it for minutes on end. People walk back and forth behind the overhead projector so that people can actually see the shape of their bodies. They forget to use pointers, they use big fat fingers. So there are many, many problems associated with visual aids. People now, of course, have gone very much into the idea of PowerPoint. And I know that an awful lot of you out there are using it, and I know an awful lot of you out there will realise that people are using them very badly. Yes, they are very sophisticated, they're very much state-of-the-art. They're not market overhead projector, of course, that's what they are. But again, I would suggest people use them badly, and they use them like they use the overhead projector. I would say to you, make sure you put on your visuals things that are visual. A lot of you will realise what you actually see are words. It's verbals. Now, you see, for me, that's my job. That's what my voice is for. It's to speak to you. Why do I want to put on an overhead projector what I'm perfectly capable of saying for myself? So why don't you put on the visual aids, visuals, not verbals? In other words, graphs, statistics, pie charts, layouts, flow diagrams, processes, photographs, cartoons, things you can't say, not what you can. And as far as the PowerPoint presentation is concerned, or when you're using the overhead projector, or even when you're using perhaps a flip chart, that you take centre stage and you only use the visual also when your words are not enough. Very often I find people come on courses with a great array of visual aids. They've spent days, weeks perhaps, getting their visual aids together, but they haven't for one moment thought about the most important thing. And the most important thing is the words. And it's only when the words are not enough to think about bringing the visual into play. Also, we have to bear in mind, as I said to you earlier, that people remember 20% of what you tell them, but they do remember 65% of what they see and hear. So there is a very valuable place for them, but please make sure that they are used only when you need them, and that they are indeed visual and not verbal. Another area where you've seen people let themselves down as far as the presentation is concerned is the question and answer session. I think there's a tendency when we've finished the presentation to make a great sigh of relief and say to ourselves, thank goodness that's over. And then we get totally caught out by the question and answer session. Question and answer sessions are really important. They are part of the etiquette of making a presentation. I know that sometimes they can be incredibly boring, so you have to work really hard to keep up the same impetus. Research tells us, that the ability of a question and answer session to harm your presentation is far greater than its ability to help it. So it needs to have rule number 1 applied to them. And rule number 1 in everything that I've said to you so far has been be prepared. So you have to be prepared for the question and answer session. So I would say to you, make sure that you know all the potential questions that are likely to come up and decide how you're going to answer them. And what you really need to do now, of course, is you need to get a like-minded group of colleagues together who understand what constructive criticism is all about, will tell you exactly what they like, exactly what they dislike about your presentation, and then get them to ask you the most difficult questions they can possibly find for you. And then I would suggest by the time you stand in front of your real audience, you will be halfway there. So we've prepared ourselves, we've got ourselves ready, we've got our presentation prepared, the day dawns and you're waiting to make the presentation. How do you mentally prepare yourself to make this an effective and powerful presentation? There are 3 ingredients that I would like to talk through with you for you to make sure that you perhaps are doing these things, or it might be there's some new ideas here that you haven't really thought about before. And those are, first of all, the relaxation of the body. Secondly, visualization. And thirdly, to use self-assertion techniques. So I believe when you sit in that chair while you're waiting to be called up to make your presentation, you have to be in control of the body. A lot of us will realise it's this stage where our body goes to jelly. So we have to sit in our chairs and get our bodies in control. So you must know the parts of your body that cause you problems. A lot of us unfortunately don't know this. So we have to be aware of our bodies. We have to build up a pattern for dealing with our bodies. Some of you will know already. You'll be able to say, I know where it is, thank you. It's my calves. They have a life of their own. Some of you will be able to say, I know where it is. It's my heavy beating heart. Some of you will be able to say, I know where it is. It's the back of my neck. That's where I get it every time. So you need to know your bodies and to sit in those chairs and getting your body ready for the challenge ahead. So to be tensing and relaxing each part of your body in turn. And do make sure that you've got your breathing under control. There's the most fantastic thing that happens with your breathing, you know. Because if you can get your breathing under control, it will do an amazing thing for you. It will bring your heart rate under control. So make sure that you are controlling your body. The next area I would suggest to you that would be invaluable is to use visualization. You must see yourself in your mind's eye with everything going absolutely according to plan. You are having a wonderful time standing up there. You are really, really enjoying yourself. Everything is going totally as you had planned. You are looking out to your audience. You can see that your audience also are having a wonderful time, really enjoying listening to you. And then I believe you must use self-assertion techniques. You must say to yourself, I can do this presentation. I will do this presentation. I will do this presentation very, very effectively. And what we're talking here, of course, is we're talking here of positive thinking. Because if you say to yourself, this presentation of mine today is going to be a disaster. It's going to be a total disaster. Why did I say I'd speak in the first place? You know what you've done, don't you? You've set yourself up for failure because that's exactly what's going to happen to you. So you must get rid of all those negative images with positive self-talk and positive visualization to know that you can do it, and then you will go ahead and you will do it effectively. So in conclusion then, we have talked through the course of this audio briefing of many areas that I consider are vitally important for you to consider when you make an effective presentation. We've talked about the body as an instrument. We've talked about the voice as an instrument to hold your audience's attention. We've talked about the importance of building warmth and rapport with your audience through your eyes. We've talked at the use of cue cards instead of a script so you can sound like yourself rather than a technical robot. We've talked about the idea of the content of the presentation. What exactly is it that you're going to say, and to get a tight structure and outline to that talk. I've also talked you through the idea of using a 3-stage approach to making a presentation. We then moved on to the idea of visual aids, to remember that you are the best visual aid that there is, and only to use your visuals when they are indeed visual. And we've also looked at the idea to remember that the question and answer session is a vital part of your presentation. So I would like you now to take every opportunity that you have to increase your visibility within your organisation and to make effective and powerful presentations.